Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Greg Johnson. I'm a senior consultant here at Energy Systems Catapult, and I'm joined here today by Gavin Starks, who will give a little bit of an intro to it in a moment. For those of you watching just now, also we'll be recording this session. It'll be on YouTube in the future. For those of you in the future, hello. So what I'm going to do today is just going to introduce Gavin, let him kind of talk through the project Perseus, and then we'll be taking questions and do a bit of a Q&A towards the end. You should see on the side that you will be able to create questions. Please do populate that through the session, and I will pick those up towards the end and start filtering those as we get on. So without too much further ado, and allow you to actually do what you came to do, which was listen to Gavin, I'll just do a brief introduction. So Icebreaker 1 is a organisation Gavin operates, and they're working with the Bankers for Net Zero and developing something called Perseus, which I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what it's doing. I think I'll leave that to Gavin. But I think it's the real interesting piece between how energy data can help the banking sector, things like insurance and so on, which I'm sure Gavin will go into detail on for you. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let the main event begin, and I'll be back shortly and we'll do the Q&A. So Gavin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Greg. My name's Gavin Starks, and I'm the founder of Icebreaker 1. And I'm going to run through a bit of what we do and why we're here. But want to start off with just maybe a bit of framing. Icebreaker 1 is a non-profit. We set up to help accelerate the journey to net zero, but with data at the core of that. But I want to just kind of start off like just the fairly existential question of why we're here. And the reason why we're here is this incredibly thin layer of our atmosphere, which is in jeopardy. It'd take you about 10 minutes to drive from the top to the bottom, I think, if you were going at a reasonable speed. So we're obviously in a climate emergency. There's no overstating that. I think we can see its impacts now around the world. But what has this got to do with data? And I think here that what we're seeing is a huge transition from a financial economy that was purely based on money to one that is now going to be regulated to include metrics and measures from the real economy. So specifically around carbon reporting, but all forms of environmental reporting are coming into the frame here at a pace and scale that is quite unusual. But the reason for that is we don't have time. We're out of time when it comes to addressing climate emergency, and we need to act, and we need to drive capital into the real economy very quickly. And capital doesn't like to flow if it's risky. So a critical driving function here is how do we use data to help de-risk investment, reduce liability, and increase the incentives for investment towards a net zero future. So with that as a bit of a starting point, I want to just talk a little bit about data as well, because the issue here isn't that data is scarce. In fact, we have too much data. Most organizations are drowning in it. The challenge that we face is connecting it. And there's a report from UN and World Bank saying that investing in data ecosystems yields a 32x return in economic benefits. And a lot of the data that we've got out there isn't being used. And there's a question in there, why is that the case? And when we're looking at climate reporting in particular, it's often looking at data that isn't in our organizations. It's scattered amongst our supply chain and across our customer chains. And our kind of driving challenge here is how do we sustain a huge number of people while we're hitting peak everything everywhere all at once? And that affects not just our energy systems, but water, food systems, transport, and so on. We're seeing this systemic change on multiple dimensions all at the same time. And that's quite overwhelming for businesses. So I spend a lot of time speaking with C-suites of large multinational companies, and everyone is either drowning in reporting standards or they're trying to tackle multiple existential crises at once using lots of different siloed systems, and it doesn't scale. And actually, it's stopping us getting to where we need to be. And I want to go back to a bit of a framing here from quite a long time ago, 30 years ago. Donella Meadows saying that missing information flows are one of the most common causes of systems malfunction. Actually, as an intervention, looking at data flow and information flow is usually cheaper and easier than rebuilding our physical infrastructure. That's a theme that I think we could really take on board, particularly within the energy sector and the challenges that we're facing and the huge number of changes that are coming. We've got lots of systems that have existed for decades that now need to work in a digital world and an interoperable world. And at the same time here, we've got more people online than existed when I was born, and more machines online than people. So we're already in an era where we're digital first, and that leads us to a question of what do we do about all of this? And so the what question is an important one. What do we have to start thinking about? How do we orient as companies? This all important preamble. You might think, well, what's this got to do with SMEs and the net zero targets? But fundamentally, when we're thinking about how data needs to flow, we need to start thinking differently about how our organizations embody themselves. Are they embodying a digital culture or a physical culture? Are they reflecting the way our physical infrastructure already works? Or are they based on the fact that as we digitize, these systems are naturally becoming more decentralized, they need to be more interoperable, and there are more systems that need to speak to each other. So we're going from a situation where there's a relatively small number of organizations to many hundreds or thousands of different organizations, from large centralized assets to many decentralized assets in the mix here. And these are all quite culturally challenging. They're from an design perspective, they're very challenging in terms of how do we build our organization for this digital future, and what is data in the mix of this. I've seen over the years many data strategies being punted over into the technology teams or described as the new oil. Actually, data is something that unblocks business value, and it increases in value the more it's connected. And that this notion of connected data is really foundational. And when we connect data well, we can see markets move. So this is a quote from a large financial organization, global financial organization, that bringing stability and trusted data sharing has enabled the market to invest at scale. And actually, in this case, this quote was from Open Banking, and a global organization that invested in the UK first, because we had created an open banking standard for data sharing. And that links into a number of things. We all know we can't manage what we don't measure, but we can act on that what we don't trust. And this word trust, I think, is going to come back a number of times in this presentation. Open banking, just to recap, we created originally the blueprint for that back in 2015. It was regulated in 2017, and now has hundreds of fintechs signed up to it in the UK. It has been copied in over 80 countries, and globally, it's now projected to be a $100 billion market. What it does is it addresses the technical and non-technical elements of data sharing in a way that the whole market can then be interoperable. Right. So when we then let's bring this back to a net zero focus. When we're looking at what data needs to be shared at market-wide scale in order to address our net zero targets, the financial sector now needs data, not just from itself, not just something like open banking where you can share your current account statements or your bank transactions with a third-party accounting package and so on. The financial sector needs reporting now on energy, on agriculture, on water and transport, the built world, and the overall climate impact of those things. And that then spins into a whole range of different things of whether that's coming from operational data. People are looking at getting right down to asset level information. If you take large asset manager, they need to know the embodied footprint of all of their assets. If you've got 100,000 buildings, you now need to report on every single asset if you're over a certain size of organization. But in order to do that, you need to know not just the energy consumption of the buildings, but you need to know the disaggregate energy consumption of the common parts of the building versus the sublet. Now, that's a massive challenge and requires things like smart metering and so on. So when you look at the top level policies have already shifted. Companies must report. But when it comes to implementing that, people are a bit lost. We're really in an early stage, and the digitalization of the energy sector is absolutely foundational to that. So in order to inform all of these reports that are required, and mandatory reporting that's coming to the financial sector, they need access to this real economy data. And we then enter into this massive acronym soup. And hopefully the signal you should be getting here is it's really confusing and hard to get your head around, because I'll come back to how we're going to simplify it in a second. What we need to do is map the data flow between the real economy and the financial economy. And here you've got top level standards that are being set by organizations like the IPCC and regulations that are being set through the FCA and other government bodies. There's an acronym soup of standards and frameworks for disclosure and reporting, whether that's the IFRS or the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures or the Carbon Disclosure Project. And this is a small subsection of a much bigger list. There's huge efforts going on to try and harmonize those top-level reporting standards, but all of them point down to one set of challenges, is that to translate the impact of an individual organization, you need to understand what it's consuming. And so there's things like the greenhouse gas protocol here, which are assessment methods. So you can say, for this number of kilowatt hours of energy consumed, this is how to turn it into a kilograms of CO2 report that forms part of your disclosure, the footprint of the organization. And then see in the bottom left of this, it's not just energy, but it's all forms of resource consumption. So the role of the accounting packages in this is vast. They have to suddenly take in data from the real economy rather than just the financial economy and turn them into reports that can be used in disclosures and ultimately used in ratings and scores by the financial markets. And those scores are then used to drive investment back into the real economy. So there's a cycle here that's a bit broken. At the moment, a lot of the work that is being done is to look at things like spend-based analysis. So you look at how much an organization is spending on energy and inferring from that what its carbon footprint is. Now, that's not ideal in many ways, as you probably immediately jump to. So there's a whole kind of ecosystem here of reporting, but this underpins how the next trillions of dollars of investment are going to be made to get us to net zero. So we have to kind of shift from an environment where the financial economy is really driven by financial metrics to one where it's driven by financial metrics and non-financial metrics. And that poses a lot of challenges. It's taken us centuries to get audit right for the financial economy, and it's still not perfect. So the idea that we're going to somehow get this to hundreds of other data points flowing into this financial ecosystem in the next few years is quite daunting. And that brings us on to an example. So as I mentioned here, like energy is one of the foundational pieces of carbon reporting. It's the energy consumption of our SMEs across the UK represents about, SMEs in general represent about 50% of the emissions, business emissions of the UK. Energy is a huge part of that. Electricity and energy is in every reporting framework, and it applies to every organization. So we've initiated this program called Perseus. It's a bit of a multi-headed challenge. And we've started this process by thinking, how can we bring together a collaboration that says, what information do you need in order to de-risk that investment loop? So in this case, it's the banks. So the banks currently, if they're looking to do a green loan, they're doing their analysis of their customers. They also have mandatory reporting. They must report on what is called financed emissions. So any loan, whether it's a mortgage, a business loan, so on, they must report on the carbon emissions related to that. Now, at the moment, that's an imperfect science. It's based on estimates in many cases. It's based on assessments from spend and so on. So the consequence of the banks is they have to put aside more capital to underwrite those loans because they're expensive. There's higher risk around them. And so all the banks have said to us is, if you can get us better assurable data, then it will de-risk the investment, which means we need to put less capital to one side to underwrite these loans. If we have to put aside less capital, that reduces the cost of capital, and we can increase green lending. So at the heart of this is better access to assurable data will make it easier for SMEs to get access to capital. And so how do we do that? The question there is, what policy instruments are needed, what underlying models are needed, and what do the banks actually need in order to de-risk that? And where we've arrived as a starting point is electricity. We can get the electricity information from every SME in the country, whether it's via smart meter or via bill or whatever the mechanism is, then that will de-risk the cost of capital and we can increase green financing for the UK. So that's the mission. As with all of these types of initiatives, you can have a great idea, but unless you build the right coalition, it's unlikely to happen, even if everybody thinks it's a good idea. So here we've managed to get top-level government support. This program is in the Green Finance Strategy. It's going to be presented at COP this year. We've had support from ministers and from organizations like Innovate Finance. And in fact, we've brought together now a whole range of different organizations at the high level. The program itself is umbrellaed under a organization called Bankers for Net Zero, which is the UK country chapter of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. There's another set of acronyms here, which is underneath the GFANZ umbrella. So this is Global Race to Zero, which the UK is championing. The steering group for this, we've brought together the British Business Bank, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, the Institute of Directors, Energy UK, UK Finance, the Federation of Small Businesses, and a range of other non-profit organizations and trade associations, as well as government, to say, let's go far together. And so that steering group represents the coming together of everybody who has a stake in this particular ecosystem and its outcomes. Because it's part of an international program, we also have observers, including the OECD and the International Chambers of Commerce, and a group called the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change. Now, their membership represents about $60 trillion worth of assets globally. And so, again, when we're looking at this, is how do we go far together and create impact at national scale? How do we start to automate the carbon footprinting for every SME in the country? This type of top-level coalition is really critical because we need all voices at the table. And in the mix then, how do we expand out of that? So looking at the broader ecosystem, we now have commercial partners on board, including the banks, NatWest, HSBC, Tide, Alica. We have the accounting packages, Sage. We're just about to announce, in fact, that Intuit has also joined. We've got the audit firms like PwC, and we've got access to the electricity information through Smart DCC as a starting point. So the ambition for this year is to build a demonstrator by COP in December, which is in a very short period of time, to say, how can we get the electricity data directly from the SME into the carbon accounting packages in an assurable way, and that reported back up to the banks so that they can have an assurable report. So it sounds very straightforward at one level, but as you can already see, there are a lot of different moving parts here. So the way that we're bringing this together is to say, let's make it easy for the user. One of the things that we know about SMEs is they don't have any time and they don't have any money to do any of this. So we've got to make it trivial. So this is a mock-up for illustration only at this stage, because we're in the middle of designing it, is to say, how can we make it trivial for an SME to participate in this? And they must have a say in this. We can't just make decisions for them. That's not how we're going to build trust with the 5.9 million SMEs in the country. The idea here is that they would have, when they log into their online banking, they'll get a pop-up saying, would you like to join this program? It's free. Please consent to share your data. Assuming that they consent, we can then validate that they and connect. And this is the same way that open banking works. If you want to connect your bank account and your current account statements to your accounting package, the same process there. And then the bank, would you be using a third party such as a Sage or an Intuit, or there's a range of carbon accounting applications out there to do the benchmarking, to do the calculation, and then the auditors would say, yes, we can assure this data flow. So really make it trivial for the SME to engage, a 2-click process, but then build a trust relationship with them. So at this point, it's the bank's customer. So the bank can build a relationship with them and say, we've identified that you would now qualify for a green finance loan. The most effective thing that you could do is install a heat pump or add in insulation, or whatever the recommendations are based on the profiling. And again, electricity is the starting point here, but it's not the end point. It's really this process is about going far together and building the rails for us to get this data to flow at national scale. So how do we do this? Right. So this is fortunately we've got some blueprints. We've done this before. So it's a 2-step process. One is collaboration to codify the rules, which is where we bring together different organizations and entities, say, what is it that they need? How do they need that information? What information do they need? What difference does it make? Basically, so what? Then technically, how do they do that? Legally, how do they do that? And are there policy interventions that are required in the mix? The way that this gets implemented then in the market is through what's called a trust framework. And a trust framework is a very, very narrow and thin layer. It basically takes the rules that have been collaboratively defined and says, this is how we can implement them in the market, whether that's for applications or other systems that need access to this data. We can create the rules and mechanisms for that to verify that people are following the rules. And in the way that we've developed this, and over the last 2-3 years, we've developed open energy. So just to expand on this, on the left-hand side, you've got the collaboration to define the rules. And with open energy itself, which is at the heart of the Perseus program, how do we then define what those rules are? The rules themselves are codified in a trust framework, in this case, open energy. And the trust framework is a very, very thin layer. It does 2 things, basically. It says, has this organization agreed the rules contractually? And then, are its systems compliant with those rules? So the trust framework never stores any data, never holds any data, but it does enable different organizations here on the right-hand side to say, yes, we can share data with each other in an assurable way. Now, there's three different ways that we can do this. We can do it with open data. So we're seeing now open data publishing using the trust framework, where applications can verify that, for example, open data best practice has been applied, that the data publishers can say, yes, we are compliant with the open data best practice principles. and the trust framework there can assure that that is the case and verify that is the case. If we've got non-open data, so data that like I know NPAN number or something like that, where we don't necessarily need the customer to consent to that sharing information, but there doesn't need to be some restrictions around that. There can be additional codes and additional licensing conditions that say, yes, this data can be shared under these certain conditions. And then for the Perseus use case, where the SME customer needs to be involved in consent, both the application, so the carbon accounting application on the top right, and the data source, which in this case is Smart DCC to begin with, they can say, are we allowed, can we check with the customer that we can share this data for this purpose? And everyone in that system can verify that they've agreed the same rules. So the trust framework there just says, have you agreed the rules? You'll see the blue line here, the data flow is always peer-to-peer. It doesn't go via any intermediary. So it would, in this case, go from Smart DCC directly to Sage or other carbon accounting application. But critically, an organization like an auditor can assure that process. And so when that goes further up the chain, either to a bank or to another financial institution, the reporting can refer back to that. So just to recap, I know I've covered a lot of different topics here. Trust framework for data sharing at market-wide scale. If we come back to that diagram that I had earlier of the amount of information that needs to now flow from the real economy into the financial economy. Electricity is just one use case. We need to cover other types of energy. We need to cover transport. We need to cover water, agriculture, and so on. I can't see how this is going to scale unless we use a common collaborative approach. Effectively, collaborate on the rules and compete on the game. And the collaboration on the rules is to make sure that we're cohesive. We've got interoperability across the whole sector and across and between sectors, which is where Perseus is another good example. The energy data there needs to flow into the financial sector. The big challenge there is typically not technology. The biggest blocker I usually find is it's to do with data rights, liability transfer, modes of redress, and so on. And it needs to be controlled. And here, baking in the ability to have different types of sharing, whether that's pre-authorized or whether it needs the consent of the customer or the end user, a trust framework can enable that to happen. We're seeing initiatives at the moment where people are saying, well, we should publish open data, but we should put an email registration process in the front of that. That is a really bad idea in a number of ways. Firstly, it breaks the point of open data, which open data is free to use by anyone for any purpose. And secondly, email is not a security protocol. In this case, it's not fit for purpose. We're also seeing things where people are saying, well, PDF might be an adequate way of publishing data. That's also not the case. We're over 30 years into the web. Interoperability today means machine readable data. And so to try and address all of these challenges, we've been very focused on how do we build this trust framework approach. Perseus is a fantastic example here of how it can unlock the data flow from ultimately what we want to see there is, all 150 plus energy suppliers in that ecosystem able to have the data shared from their customers into the many hundreds of financial services that require that information with the permission of the customer. So it's quite a complex picture, but we have got a path through it and we have got a roadmap to get there. So just as one thing to take away from the huge number of concepts and ideas I've just thrown at you all, is to connect, not collect. And that's a deep cultural shift for organizations to get their heads around. How do we share data with many third parties, with potentially hundreds or thousands of different external partners without introducing new complexity on the technical and legal side? And here, I think we've got a way through that we would love to collaborate with people on this call and beyond on. So I will pause there, and we can break for questions. I'm sure we'll have many. Greg.
Great, thank you very much, Gavin. I think my colleague Tabitha will rearrange the screens for us momentarily. And hopefully everyone can hear me there. I'm back on screen. So just first and foremost, want to apologise to everyone in the audience. We've had a bit of a technical challenge with the questions coming in. We are trying to address in the background, but for the moment, Gavin and I will kind of go with some questions that we've had filtered through to us via email and other methods in the last half an hour or so. And we'll just kind of proceed on that basis. So I think I can do something quite nifty and actually display a question up on the screen so everyone can see it. And then I'll just hand over to you, Gavin, and we can maybe have a bit back and forth and take our meander through for the next 27 and a half minutes or so. First and foremost, do you think policy and regulation and train is sufficient to scale projects such as Perseus, or is more needed to be done? I think this is kind of looking at the data bills and such that are kind of in train at the moment. So interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we've got bits of it, but never enough. I should say I also sit on the Smart Data Council as one of the members there, and it's tasked with trying to apply the principles coming out of the data bill across the economy, and explicitly applying the lessons learned from open banking across the economy. And that isn't just energy; it's looking right across telco to health and so on. There's a huge number of challenges there. The policy and regulation in train, there's a lot of work going on right now with the virtual energy system, the digital spine, open energy, the national digital twin program, and so on. So there's a lot of activity. I think we're in a turbulent period, shall we say, because there's a lot of different initiatives. The good news is, from what I can see, is we're all starting to land on a similar kind of architecture. And part of the very macro level, the important elements to split out in that architecture is to separate data governance from data management and data flow. So the systems that store data shouldn't be the systems, or that shouldn't be the organizations that are governing the data. And what we've tried to do with the trust framework approach is split out the definition of the roles from the codification of the rules to the implementation of those rules in the market through whatever services. You need the market to have as open a market as possible. So I think it's extremely challenging, I think, for policymakers, because there's so many moving parts, and we're in the best place we've been in the last 10 years to nail this. So it's a bit of a mixed thing. We're not doing. We need to do more.
Data architecture, and we're kind of landing. Maybe expand on that a little bit, because I think that's a term that commonly people misunderstand.
Yes, I think it comes back to when we start talking about data, quite often the conversation ends up just being about technology, and really it's not a technology problem. There's a vast abundance of technology solutions out there. There are thousands of data standards and so on. The important thing really in terms of how do you create interoperability across a marketplace is to have legal cohesion. So having clarity about, am I allowed to share this data? And if I do, what happens when something goes wrong? Because something will go wrong at some point. And so the biggest blocker I've seen to data sharing initiatives isn't technical, it's legal. Because the lawyers quite rightly say, unless you can quantify what the liability is, we're going to say no. Unless you can quantify what happens when things go wrong, we're going to say no. And that's completely right. Compliance officer, that's their job, right? To make sure that we have processes in place to address what happens when things go wrong. There are national security concerns. There's a whole bunch of reasons to say no. And so the design parameters here around how do we create the data architecture for the country is to try and move these things forward together. So looking at the technical elements, looking at the legal elements, and looking at the policy elements in concert. And the only way I've found that has managed to successfully navigate that have been projects where there's a really clear use case. And I can't overstate that. Every initiative I've seen and been involved with that has started very generic has run aground in some form because it hasn't had a really clear use case that it's going to try and address. There might be thousands of use cases to be addressed, but you've got to get one right first. And once you've got one right, you can expand that kind of horizontally. And then then it becomes clearer to everybody, what does data governance mean? What is the systems architecture for data sharing? Whose servers need to exist where in order for data to flow? Does there need to be a centralized system for certain types of application? Can it just live at the edge? Or usually some hybrid of those things? And then what technologies exist in the stack? We get bombarded with technology solutions every minute of the day. But again, if you mandate the fact that then, regardless of the technical architecture, there needs to be in the web of data, there needs to be an API endpoint. There needs to be some addressable thing on the web that people can access. Now, there might be security around that. That's fine. We've done that with open banking already. You can use OAuth 2. You can use all these different sort of mechanisms that are well tested and proven and power the web. So there's a lot of the tech piece that I think we quite often get stuck on when there's a plethora of solutions that are tried and tested across the world. It's really the breakthrough comes when you pick a narrow use case and bring together the legal, policy, and technical pieces into the same conversation.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I suppose then kind of looking at that use case driven narrative, obviously you've got your kind of early use case, smart meter data, transitioning that over to the banking sector and using that to kind of drive essentially cost of capital decisions and insurance, so on. So my understanding from when you went through, you're demonstrating that now, or and looking to do that by COP, I think is what I heard. And then
Yep.
what do you think is next after that?
Well, I think that here, let's be clear. By COP, we'll have a demonstrator that shows how electricity information can flow through the system here to the carbon accounting packages, through to the banks, and based on that the banks can change their lending behaviors.
Mhm.
And if we can get those rails in place, what we'll do next year is say, how does that then scale? Because the whole point of this is scalability. So how does that scale to everybody who has access to electricity information? So that's every retailer, but it's also other services out in the market that are doing commercial metering in buildings. So that goes into the kind of large scale building management systems. How do you get information disaggregate through the sublets in an office so that you can disaggregate what you're liable for as an asset manager versus the individual organizations within it? If you've got one floor that's got a data center on it and the other floor is an accountancy practice, you've got quite different footprints. And that's coming at us. And I think we need to not shy away from that. We need to lean into it and say, how do we address this at scale? But the principles underpinning that are to create the rails. How do we create the underlying infrastructure that says, yes, once we've agreed what the rules are for this data sharing, both technical and legal and policy, then this information can flow. So scaling on electricity, scaling on other types of fuel, obviously gas and beyond, and then looking at other sectors like agriculture, which is extremely challenging. And in those instances, it might be Earth observation data that is the source of a lot of the large macro scale, because some of the Earth observation data is astonishing now. It's multispectral, it's whole Earth, it's 3-meter resolution on a daily basis. So we're starting to see those data sets are out there, but they're not accessible and addressable in this way because the business models are not aligned with the needs. So how do we enable some of that information to flow? Instead of a data license for X million to get the whole data set, we just need this one sliver for every company. And the aggregate of that might be, well, we'll have a different economic around it.
Of course. So I guess we're kind of transitioning a little bit into what I'd like to just pick your brains on is that observation of different sectors. So we've focused quite a lot on banking and energy. Um, uh, would your impression be that they're probably a little bit further along in this journey, and then maybe just some observations on where the other sectors are would be quite useful?
Certainly. So we've already been approached because of Perseus, and again, this is why one of our working groups here is around communications.
Hmm.
Getting a very clear use case and a clear story has totally transformed what we've been doing with open energy. We really struggled at the beginning because we had some use cases, but they didn't really ignite people's imagination as much as we'd have liked. They might have been very good use cases, but Perseus really brought it to life because we said, like, if we can get this to work at scale, there are billions in capital to be unlocked from the banks into the SME community. And the ability that story itself has then brought the insurance sector to the table. It's brought the asset managers to the table. It's bringing different types of financial instrument providers to the table and say, how do we do? We need the same information, basically. How do we do this as well? So there's a vector there of scaling across some of the financial sector actors. There's a vector here of saying, well, if this is designed to help the SMEs go on this journey with minimal intervention, there's a huge market then for the likes of the carbon accounting applications to add intelligence to, well, if we can start bringing together lots of different pieces of information, we can create really tailored interventions for each business and say, actually, let's benchmark a whole sector. It's currently extremely hard to do. How would you benchmark a particular sector across the whole country? Look at the top 20 percentile that are using too much of whatever resource. What are the interventions that are going to help them? So there's a vector there of scaling across the intervention types, which is not in our remit at all. That's up to the application vendors to do. And then there's the international dimension to this. Scope 3 is talked about like incessantly at the moment. So scope 3 is the supply chain emissions from a business. And it typically is over 80% of any organization's emissions are in their supply chain. And the challenge with that is that it's a really easy way to outsource the problem. So, well, most of it's in our supply chain. We'll just ask our suppliers to do it. The challenge with that, your suppliers are everywhere in the world, and they are also going through the same conversation. So we've got this incredible many-to-many problem. So part of the reason we've got this international group observing what we're doing is to say, okay, how would this scale internationally? And that opens up another raft of questions about cross-border data sharing that has implications potentially on national security, certainly has commercial implications, may well have implications on taxation and cross-border taxes. It's a labyrinthine, but at the heart of it, we just want to say, can we get one piece of data to flow into the market in a way that's protected?
Yeah.
Not just protected, usable. So
Useful.
both of those things are applicable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does certainly sound like the key unlocking here might be that kind of financial driver. So the use case that you've selected here does seem to motivate other sectors of
Well,
agriculture.
there's financial incentives here coming, not just direct investment, because capital is looking for provable and demonstrable green investments. And you're seeing countries move on this. The US obviously just announced a huge amount of investment, over $1 trillion of investment. There's also tax incentives that can be built on top of this as well. And a lot of the economic benefits here are going to have to be driven by tax incentives. And again, it comes back to how much can you trust the data? Because at scale, it's extremely difficult to do. And we're getting to the point now where some organizations are stopping publishing data because they're worried about getting sued. So we're coming up the kind of in the mix here and saying we can provide a way of enabling verification and assurance around data. Then it should help everybody de-risk their investment strategies and more capital will flow.
Makes a lot of sense. Just to kind of change track a little bit with the next question, I'm just going to pop up on the screen so everyone can see. Mentioned a lot about this is not a technical challenge. So what do you think the key cultural challenges organizations you're working with are having to make in order to kind of make headway in this space?
So my general observation is in every sector that I'm dealing with, and that covers most industrial sectors and financial sectors. Everyone's extremely busy and a bit overwhelmed with the day job. And the day job is typically mushroomed to include ESG reporting or add flex markets and then work out how that interfaces with the rest of the business. Oh, and you've got net zero target and you've got this and you've got that. So there's a huge, as we're going into this world, and this is why I started off in my presentation with systems thinking. Systems thinking is really hard. And what we can't do, what doesn't scale, is any one organization trying to do that on their own, because we'll individually, we just break. We can deal with a certain amount of complexity in front of us. But once it gets too complex, you try and reduce it all and say, well, I can only do this one thing. And so what we need to double down on is that question of interoperability. Now, data can be our friend here, or it can be our a rod for our backs. Because if we get bombarded with more and more information, but it isn't in a way that's usable, can be synthesized into decisions, and actually helps us map out these different systems, we're just going to run aground. And at the same time, we've got all these marvelous new systems that are coming online just kind of when we need them, like all the AI systems and so on. But garbage in, garbage out. If we feed them the wrong information, we're going to get the wrong answers, even if they're very smart, right? So let's work out how we get this foundational piece. And we talk about data infrastructure here, meaning get the foundations of data sharing right. Work out what the rules are around that. And there's plenty of challenges around making data available in a context that can be used by AI. There's lots of positives and there's lots of unknowns in the mix there. I was reading just yesterday, there's some AI now that can, from the sound of you typing in your password, work out what your password is from the keystrokes that it's listening to. So there's very much unintended things we don't know yet. And when we don't know something, again, quite rightly, compliance people will shut down progress because there's unknown risks. So we need a path here that takes us through and says, let's try this one thing, and we can constrain the one thing legally. We can put the technical rails in to say, yes, this can be shared, but legally you're only allowed to do this one thing with it. And then once we've proven that, we can say, let's do 2 things, and then 4 things, and then grow from there. So I think the cultural question is, as organizations, we need people in our organizations who are thinking about and actively engaging in how do we network with our customer chains, how do we network with our supply chains and other market actors in a way that's collaborative, but doesn't step on our equal needs to compete. So that's why we say collaborate on the rules, compete on the game is the outcome.
Yeah, it's certainly something I'd heard at a conference not long ago. Like the biggest driver for change tends to be contract clauses. Say, you need to demonstrate this, or else we will use someone else. And that seems to be kind of what you're getting at to an extent. I wonder, you talked, I suppose we kind of deviated a little bit into AI, but it's still a relevant point in that there are those known risks, there are unknown risks. What do you think the known risks are around this kind of data sharing ecosystem that you're kind of helping develop that maybe haven't been solved or resolved yet, if any? Or do we think we're on the path?
I think there's thousands of things we've not resolved. I know you've been in conversation with other government departments like the Office of AI and so on. And data governance is a massive question. And it's certainly something that is front of mind at the Smart Data Council. And I think the intervention at this stage, because we know we've got a million questions coming at us, is we need a process to deal with the questions. But rather than saying, well, let's wait and build the perfect system, whatever that technical system is, we need to pick use cases out of that and say, let's take this one through a process and say, for this application, we can enable this data sharing. But we've got a peer-to-peer way of data sharing with a mechanism for centralizing the data governance. And for me, it's the only thing I've seen scale in the same way that open banking has scaled and is now in the data bill. It's apply those principles across the rest of the financial economy and the rest of the economy. We've seen other countries as well try and copy it, and where they've copied bits of it and said, "Oh, we can just do this with tech," they fail. When they say, "Oh, well, let's try and do everything at once," they fail. So we've got examples now, over 80 countries around the world have tried to do open banking. The ones that have succeeded have stuck with two principles. One is do one thing well, and two is let's do it together. And so those are the patterns I'd say that we've got to pick those kind of examples. It's a bit like the questions around data ethics. If you have a data ethics question, you'll be here for, quite rightly, forever, right? Because ethics is a very subjective idea. If we talk about data rights, can I do this thing with this data for this purpose? It narrows it down in a way that lawyers can then go, yes, we can constrain that. Or here are the specific liabilities that happen. And here's how we can mitigate or protect against unintended consequences. So I think that it's about process. It's quite boring at some level, but it's the dull bit's always the wiring, isn't it? You've got to get the wiring right.
Yeah, I think that kind of noted. Looking back to the energy digitalization and the data task force before it, is Laura Sands talking about the plumbing. It's like, I mean, okay, I'm wearing a red top. I don't have my dungarees on. I'm not quite Mario doing the plumbing, although I'm not entirely sure how much he ever did that in the games. But it is the boring bit that you need to get right. And I think that's not to class Perseus as a bit boring, but certainly it's trying to achieve.
I often think that the greatest change, if you're trying to create something at scale, it's actually quite dull. At one level, but it needs to be brought to life by examples like Perseus that say, well, if we get this right, it'll unlock money for people who need money to do things to create the change we must create in the world, and we must get to net zero quickly.
I couldn't agree more there. So I think we're going to do one short more wee question, then we'll probably just wrap up there. So I think I'm going to go with this one. And how do you see Perseus interacting with other data sharing initiatives going on within energy or elsewhere?
Yeah, well, again, interoperability is at the heart of it. Perseus itself is built on top of open energy, which is designed as a general trust framework for the energy sector. We're applying the same framework across water. We're involved with the Stream initiative, which is funded through Ofwat. But on the Smart Data Council, I sit next to the Open Banking Implementation Entity, which is the organization that implements open banking. And so we're starting to explore now, what does an integration look like? What does interoperability look like between the trust framework of open energy and the trust framework of open banking? There's no reason why they can't be interoperable. We just haven't done it yet. So let's do that and work out what the questions are and work out where the challenges are and navigate through that. From my point of view, I've worked my entire career on the web, which is, web didn't exist when I was studying. It's existed throughout my professional career. It's the most successful information architecture in history, and we just need to keep building on it. So I just come back to, if it's not interoperable, then we shouldn't be doing it. That's there's a mandate there to say, make whatever you're doing discoverable on the web. Doesn't mean give it all away. Make it discoverable on the web in a machine readable format, and we'll take it from there.
That's really useful insight. Okay, so again, apologies to everyone who was present and listening to Gavin's great presentation there and answering the questions that managed to filter through to us. Apologies for you not being able to submit your own there. A bit of a technical hitch at our end. So I guess just sum up and thank Gavin for his presentation there. Hugely insightful. I think within the registration link, you saw some links and details that you can engage with Perseus and other initiatives that Gavin mentioned, things like Smart Data Council and so on. And certainly do reach out to myself or another colleague at ESC or Gavin directly if there's any questions that you might have, or any kind of open calls for collaboration that Gavin noted earlier in the presentation. So thank you all for attending. The recording should be up shortly for those of you that want to watch again. If you don't quite get enough of Gavin or my beard. And with that, I'll just ask Tabitha to close us off today. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.